The winter wind carved through the naked branches of ancient oaks, moaning across the vast grounds of Ashford Estate like a requiem sung by invisible choirs. And within the great house itself, fires blazed in every hearth, yet seemed powerless against the chill that pervaded the stone corridors and gilded drawing rooms, where Lady Cecilia Hartwell stood in her travelling cloak, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the terrible, electric anticipation that had seized her heart the moment her carriage passed beneath the iron gates. She was a woman of modest fortune, possessed of no particular beauty, save for the unusual clarity of her grey eyes and the natural grace with which she carried herself, and she had no right to be here among these glittering aristocrats who gathered for the Duke of Ashford's winter house party. No right except for the tenuous connection through her cousin, the Duchess of Pembroke, who had secured the invitation with well-meaning interference that Cecilia now half regretted. The welcome dinner that first evening was held in a dining room of such grandeur that the candlelight seemed to lose itself in the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, and Cecilia found herself seated at a position neither honoured nor entirely forgotten, surrounded by ladies whose jewels caught the light like imprisoned stars, and gentlemen whose conversation flowed with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world. And there, at the head of the table, presided the Duke himself, Sebastian Ashford, a man whose dark hair held threads of premature silver at the temples, and whose face might have been carved from the same stone as his ancestral home, all sharp angles and aristocratic severity, beautiful in the way that winter itself is beautiful, remote and forbidding. Cecilia had allowed herself one glance, just one, before lowering her eyes to her plate, but that single look had confirmed what her treacherous heart had whispered during all the weeks of preparation and travel. He was exactly as she remembered, exactly as he had appeared in her thoughts during 2 long years of trying and failing to forget. When the soup was served, she had gathered her courage like a threadbare shawl around her shoulders and attempted what any well-bred guest might attempt, a polite observation about the estate's remarkable architecture, her voice soft but clear as she addressed the Duke across the expanse of damask and silver. The conversations around them had continued, a river of cultured voices discussing politics and scandal and the prospects for the hunting season. But in the space between Cecilia and the Duke, silence fell like an executioner's blade. He had turned to her then, his eyes the colour of a winter sea, and for one heartbeat she had seen something flicker in their depths, something that might have been recognition or pain or perhaps both, before his expression hardened into something cruel and absolute. "Don't speak to me," he had said, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, yet loud enough to ensure that her humiliation would ripple outward through whispers and sidelong glances. And then he had returned his attention to his plate, as though she had ceased to exist entirely, as though she were merely another shadow among the many that haunted his ancestral home. Cecilia had felt the heat rise to her cheeks, had felt the curious and pitying gazes of the other guests settle upon her like a weight she would carry for the remainder of the evening, but she had held herself still and composed, had managed to lift her spoon with a hand that barely shook, had even smiled at something her neighbour said, though she could not have repeated the words if her life had depended upon it. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of courses she could not taste, and conversations that washed over her like waves over a drowning woman, and when at last the ladies withdrew, and she could escape to the chambers that had been prepared for her, she found herself standing at the window of her room, her forehead pressed against the cold glass, staring out at the winter landscape, where snow had begun to fall in soft, relentless silence. The humiliation burned in her chest like swallowed coals, but beneath it lay something worse, something she could scarcely bear to acknowledge. The resurrection of a hope she had thought long buried, the terrible realization that despite everything, despite 2 years of distance and determined forgetting, despite the cruelty he had just inflicted upon her with such casual precision, her heart still quickened at the sight of him, still yearned toward him like a flower toward killing frost. What foolishness, what absolute madness had brought her here, to this place where she could only suffer, where the object of her secret, shameful admiration had looked upon her and found her so unworthy that even the basic courtesy of conversation was more than he could bear to grant. The tears came then, silent and hot, tracking down her cheeks as the snow continued its gentle descent beyond the window, and Cecilia wrapped her arms around herself and wondered how she would survive the weeks ahead, trapped in this beautiful, terrible house with a man who had commanded her silence as though she were nothing at all. 3 months earlier, in the fading golden light of an autumn afternoon, Cecilia had sat in the drawing room of her modest country home, reading and rereading the letter that had arrived in her cousin's elegant hand, the Duchess of Pembroke's invitation to join the Duke of Ashford's winter house party, arriving like a gift and a curse intertwined. And she had known even then, in that moment of first reading, that she should decline, should invent some excuse, should protect herself from the foolish hope that had immediately bloomed in her chest like a winter rose that would surely die in the frost. But she had accepted, of course she had accepted, because 2 years prior, during a London season that her modest inheritance had barely afforded, she had attended a ball where the Duke of Ashford had still been in half mourning for his late wife, a shadowy figure at the edge of the festivities, and Cecilia, overwhelmed by the crowd and the heat and her own social inadequacy, had retreated to a balcony for air, only to find him there already, staring out at the darkened gardens with an expression of such profound sorrow that she had frozen, uncertain whether to intrude or retreat. He had noticed her then, had turned with the obvious intention of leaving, but she had stumbled slightly on the threshold, and he had reached out instinctively to steady her, his hand warm through the thin fabric of her glove, and for one moment, one brief, impossible moment, their eyes had met, and he had smiled, a small, sad smile that had nevertheless transformed his severe features into something almost tender, and he had said, "Careful, the stones are uneven here," before releasing her and disappearing back into the ballroom, leaving her standing there with her heart racing and her hand still tingling from his touch. It had been nothing, she had told herself 1,000 times since, merely a moment of ordinary courtesy that any gentleman might have extended, but it had lodged itself in her heart like a thorn she could neither extract nor ignore, and when the invitation had arrived promising weeks in his company, she had convinced herself that perhaps, impossibly, there might be some chance of a connection, some possibility of transforming that single moment into something more. Now, standing in the cold morning light of her second day at Ashford Estate, Cecilia understood the full measure of her delusion, understood that whatever she had seen in his face that night on the balcony had been a ghost, a figment, a projection of her own desperate longing, and she steeled herself to navigate the remainder of the house party with whatever dignity she could salvage, avoiding the Duke's presence as completely as the confines of his home would allow. The breakfast room was filled with guests discussing plans for riding and walks when she entered, and she had barely taken her seat when a gentleman across the table addressed her with genuine warmth, introducing himself as Lord Edmund Blackwell, and asking with such sincere interest about her journey to Ashford that she found herself responding naturally, gratefully, to his easy conversation and kind eyes. He was handsome in an open, uncomplicated way, his smile ready and his manner devoid of any aristocratic condescension, and when he suggested they join the walking party that afternoon, she had agreed with a relief that bordered on gratitude, sensing in him a potential ally in this house, where she felt so acutely unwelcome. Throughout the day, as she walked the frozen paths with Lord Blackwell, and laughed at his stories, and allowed herself to be charmed by his attentiveness, she remained aware, with a sixth sense she could not suppress, of the Duke's presence at the periphery of every gathering, his tall figure appearing in doorways and at windows, his unreadable gaze following her movements with an intensity that she told herself she imagined that surely signified nothing more than the casual notice a host might give any guest, and yet which raised the small hairs on the back of her neck and made her acutely conscious of every word she spoke, every smile she bestowed upon Lord Blackwell, every moment of ease she managed to achieve in this place that had become, through the Duke's cruelty, a beautiful prison where her heart was both captive and condemned. Weeks passed in a rhythm that Cecilia came to know as both comfort and torment. The days marked by walks through the frost-rimed gardens with Lord Blackwell at her side, his conversation unfailingly pleasant and his attention unfailingly directed toward her in a way that soothed the raw wound the Duke's dismissal had opened, and the evenings filled with card games and musical performances and all the elaborate rituals of country house entertainment, where she found herself laughing more genuinely than she had expected, finding in Edmund's presence a kind of ease that felt like balm upon burned skin. Yet always, at the edge of every gathering, she was aware of the Duke's presence, his tall figure occupying doorways and alcoves, his dark eyes following her movements, with an intensity that she told herself she imagined that surely meant nothing, that was merely the projection of her own disordered feelings onto a man who had made his indifference brutally clear. And she forced herself to turn away, to redirect her attention to Edmund's kind face, to the pleasant present rather than the impossible past. The storm arrived on a Thursday afternoon, driving the guests indoors from their planned expedition to the village, and they gathered instead in the blue drawing-room for tea, the windows rattling with wind and the fireplace blazing against the sudden cold, and Cecilia found herself seated on a delicate chair near the tea service, engaged in conversation with Lady Pemberton about nothing of consequence, when she reached for her cup and misjudged the distance, her fingers catching the saucer's edge and sending tea cascading across the polished table in a spreading stain that seemed to announce her clumsiness to the entire room. She looked up in mortification and found the Duke standing not 3 feet away, having just entered the room, the tea pooling dangerously close to where he stood, and she rose quickly with stammered apologies, reaching for a napkin to contain the damage, her cheeks burning with humiliation that was made worse by his proximity, by the way he stood utterly still and utterly silent, watching her frantic attempts to repair what she had done. "I'm so terribly sorry, Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, looking up at him with eyes that pleaded for some acknowledgement, some sign that he saw her as something more than an inconvenience. But he said nothing, merely looked at her with an expression she could not read, before turning and leaving the room without a word, his departure as silent and condemning as his presence had been. Lord Blackwell was at her side immediately, taking the sodden napkins from her trembling hands, murmuring reassurances that it was nothing, that such accidents happened to everyone, that she mustn't distress herself, and she was grateful for his kindness, even as she felt something inside her break a little more, the realization settling over her like the storm settling over the estate, that she could not continue like this, could not continue to hope for warmth from a man who had shown her nothing but ice, and could not continue to measure every moment against the impossible standard of one smile on a balcony 2 years ago. That night, lying in her bed with the wind howling against the windows, Cecilia made a decision that felt like both surrender and survival. She would let go of her foolish admiration for the Duke, would release the dream that had brought her here, would turn her face toward Lord Blackwell's sunny affection and away from Sebastian Ashford's winter coldness, and though the decision brought tears rather than relief, she told herself it was necessary, that holding on to love where none was returned was a form of slow death, and she deserved better than to waste her heart on a man who could not even bear to hear her voice. The announcement of the winter ball came during breakfast on a frost-bright morning, the prospect of dancing and formal celebration stirring excitement among the guests who had grown restless in the confines of indoor entertainment, and Cecilia felt her pulse quicken with both anticipation and dread at the thought of such an event, knowing that it would require navigating the Duke's presence in a context that demanded social grace and proximity she had thus far managed to avoid. The days preceding the ball passed in a flurry of preparation, ladies discussing gowns and jewels, gentlemen arranging for particular partners, and Lord Blackwell had approached Cecilia in the morning room with a request delivered so charmingly that she could not refuse, asking for the honor of the first dance, with a smile that suggested he already knew her answer, and she had agreed with a warmth that surprised her, finding in his consistent kindness a reason to look forward rather than back, to embrace possibility rather than mourn impossibility. The evening of the ball arrived cold and clear, stars brilliant in the winter sky, and Cecilia descended the grand staircase in a gown of pale blue silk that her modest means had nevertheless allowed her to commission for the season, her hair dressed with simple elegance, her heart beating with the strange mixture of excitement and resignation that had become her constant companion in this house. The ballroom blazed with candlelight, the chandeliers casting their golden glow over assembled guests in their finest attire, and Lord Blackwell was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes lighting with appreciation as he offered his arm and led her toward the dancing, and she was aware, with that sixth sense she could not suppress, of the Duke standing in the shadows near the tall windows, his figure barely visible in the darkness beyond the light, watching as Edmund led her onto the floor for the opening waltz. They moved together with easy grace, Edmund's conversation light and pleasant, his hand steady at her waist, and Cecilia found herself genuinely smiling, genuinely enjoying the moment, until a burst of laughter from a group of ladies near the refreshment table caught her attention during a turn, and she heard, with the terrible clarity of accidental eavesdropping, Lady Pemberton's voice saying, "Such a tragedy, really. The Duke has been frozen in grief these 3 years since his wife died. They say he can barely stand to be in company, that he sees her ghost in every room of this house." And another voice responding, "I heard she died quite suddenly, some illness, and he was away on business. Unable to reach her in time to say farewell, the guilt of it has destroyed him." The words struck Cecilia like a physical blow, understanding flooding through her even as she maintained her steps in the dance, and she felt a sharp pang of comprehension for the man who had been so cruel to her, saw his coldness suddenly in the context of unbearable loss and guilt, and yet she reminded herself fiercely that grief, however profound, did not excuse deliberate unkindness, that understanding his pain did not erase her own. The dance ended, Edmund led her from the floor with his hand gentle at her elbow, and as they paused to take refreshment, he produced from his pocket a small wrapped parcel which he presented to her with an expression of pleased anticipation, explaining that she had mentioned in passing during one of their walks her love of botanical sketches, and he had noticed this volume in the Duke's library and obtained permission to give it to her, a book of pressed flowers from distant lands with exquisite illustrations that must have taken him considerable effort to secure. Cecilia felt tears prick her eyes at his thoughtfulness, at the way he listened and remembered the small details of her conversation, at the kindness that asked for nothing in return but her happiness, and she thanked him with genuine emotion, holding the book as though it were something precious, even as her gaze drifted involuntarily toward the shadows where the Duke had stood, finding the space now empty, the darkness unoccupied, as though he had been merely a phantom conjured by her guilty conscience and the gossip's tales of ghosts. The friendship between Cecilia and Lady Arabella Ashford began quite naturally in the days following the winter ball, when the Duke's younger sister sought her out in the music room where Cecilia had gone to practice, and Arabella entered with the kind of warmth that seemed utterly incongruous with her brother's coldness, settling herself on the window seat and declaring that she was desperately in need of pleasant company after enduring Lady Pemberton's interminable stories about her daughter's musical accomplishments. Arabella was perhaps 3 years younger than Cecilia, possessed of dark curls and intelligent eyes that reminded Cecilia painfully of her brother. Yet where Sebastian's gaze was shuttered and distant, Arabella's sparkled with curiosity and genuine kindness, and their conversations became a daily occurrence, ranging from trivial matters of fashion and gossip to deeper discussions of literature and philosophy that Cecilia found nourishing in a way she had not anticipated. It was during one such conversation, as they sat together in the conservatory watching snow fall beyond the glass walls, that Arabella spoke of her brother with a sadness that made Cecilia's heart ache despite her determination to remain indifferent to the Duke's troubles. "He was not always as you see him now," Arabella said quietly, her fingers tracing patterns on the frost-covered window. "Before Caroline's death, Sebastian was the warmest person I knew, quick to laugh, generous with his affection, beloved by everyone who knew him, and when she died, it was as though something fundamental in him died as well, and I have watched him retreat further into himself with each passing month until I fear he has forgotten how to be anything but cold." Cecilia listened with her throat tight, understanding more with each word yet still nursing the wound of his cruelty, and she asked carefully whether the Duke had loved his wife very much, to which Arabella replied that he had, but that she sometimes wondered if his current state was less about love than about guilt, about the terrible burden of not being present when Caroline needed him most. Then Arabella had turned to Cecilia with an expression of puzzlement, saying something that sent a shiver through her. "You know, it is the strangest thing, but you remind my brother of someone, I am certain of it, for I have caught him watching you when he thinks no one observes, and there is something in his face, some recognition or pain or perhaps both, though I cannot fathom whom you might resemble or why it should trouble him so." Cecilia had deflected the observation, redirecting the conversation to safer topics. But the words haunted her through the following days as preparations began for the Christmas celebrations that would mark the heart of the winter season. The great hall was to be decorated in the traditional manner, and Cecilia found herself among the party of ladies and gentlemen who volunteered to assist with the greenery and ribbons, climbing ladders to hang garlands of holly and ivy, her laughter ringing out, as Lord Blackwell made some amusing observation about the precariousness of their positions. And it was in the midst of this merriment that she became aware of the Duke's presence in the doorway, his tall figure motionless in the shadows, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Their eyes met across the expanse of the hall, and for a moment that seemed suspended outside time, she saw something in his expression that was neither coldness nor indifference, but rather a profound and terrible longing, and then he turned and walked away without speaking, his departure as silent as his arrival, leaving Cecilia standing on her ladder with her hands full of holly and her heart full of questions that had no answers. Christmas Eve arrived with a hushed reverence that seemed to settle over Ashford, like the snow that had fallen throughout the night, transforming the estate into something ethereal and apart from the ordinary world, and the guests spent the day in gentle activities walking the grounds to admire the winter landscape, gathering in the drawing rooms for games and conversation, preparing themselves for the evening's celebration that would include a formal dinner and midnight service in the family chapel. Lord Blackwell had grown noticeably more attentive to Cecilia in recent days, his kindness acquiring a quality of intentionality that she could not mistake, and while his company remained pleasant and his conversation engaging, she felt within herself a growing unease that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the Duke, whose presence in the house had become increasingly troubled, his appearance at meals sporadic, his participation in social activities virtually non-existent. Arabella had mentioned with concern that Sebastian was spending long hours alone in his study, and Cecilia had seen him herself, on several occasions, through open doorways, sitting in shadow with a glass of brandy in his hand, his posture suggesting a man wrestling with demons that offered no quarter and accepted no surrender. After dinner, as the guests dispersed to prepare for the evening service, Cecilia realized she had left her prayer book in the library and went to retrieve it. The corridors quiet and dimly lit as she made her way through the house, and when she pushed open the library door, she found not the empty room she expected, but the Duke standing at the window, his back to her, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit snow beyond, and the scent of brandy hung heavy in the air. She froze in the doorway, her breath catching, every instinct telling her to retreat before he became aware of her presence. But some small sound must have betrayed her, for he turned slowly, and even in the darkness she could see the devastation in his face, the evidence of some internal battle that had left him wounded and weary. "Your Grace, I apologize," she began, the words automatic, and then she remembered his command, the prohibition he had laid upon her in front of witnesses, and she closed her mouth, turning to leave with as much dignity as she could muster, her hand already on the door handle when his voice stopped her. "Wait." The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and Cecilia turned back to him, her heart beating so violently she thought it must be audible in the quiet room, hope and confusion warring within her as she met his gaze across the expanse of polished floor. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the shadows, and she waited, scarcely breathing, for whatever words would follow that singular command. But none came. He simply stood there, looking at her with something that might have been longing or regret or both, his lips parting as though to speak, and then closing again, and finally he turned back to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension, and his silence a dismissal more cruel than any words could have been. Cecilia felt tears burn behind her eyes, felt anger and hurt rise in her throat like bile, and she left without another word, pulling the door closed behind her with exquisite care, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing it slam, and she walked quickly through the corridors to Arabella's chambers, where she knocked with trembling hands and was admitted immediately, her composure finally crumbling as she sank into the chair. Her friend offered and confessed in broken sentences her impossible, conflicted feelings for a man who treated her with such incomprehensible cruelty, yet who watched her with eyes that spoke of suffering she could not fathom and did not know how to heal. January arrived with a thaw that turned the snow to slush and the pristine landscape to something grey and uninviting, And with the new year came a subtle shift in the dynamics of the house party, for Lord Blackwell's attentions towards Cecilia had evolved from the friendly warmth of companionship into something unmistakably deliberate. His courtship conducted with such propriety and obvious sincerity that even the most cynical observers remarked upon it with approval, noting that he would make her an excellent husband, that they seemed well suited in temperament and interests, that it was fortunate indeed for a young woman of modest fortune to attract the regard of such an eligible gentleman. Cecilia accepted his attentions with a mixture of gratitude and resignation, for she had resolved after the painful Christmas Eve encounter to abandon whatever foolish hopes she had harbored regarding the Duke, to embrace the future that Lord Blackwell offered, with its promise of kindness and stability and affection that might not set her soul aflame, but would at least not burn her with its coldness. The Duke himself had become increasingly agitated in these weeks, his appearances at social gatherings marked by a restlessness that manifested in his pacing, his inability to remain seated for any length of time, his habit of entering rooms only to leave them moments later, as though he could find no peace anywhere within his own house. Yet still, he maintained his terrible silence towards Cecilia. Still, he refused to speak directly to her, and she had begun to hate him for it, even as some treacherous part of her heart continued to ache in his presence. The sledding party was organized by several of the younger guests on a bright afternoon, when the temperature had dropped again and frozen the slush into something manageable, and Cecilia found herself laughing with genuine pleasure as she descended the hill behind the south gardens, the cold air burning her cheeks and the speed exhilarating after so many days confined indoors. And it was on her third descent that her sled hit an unexpected ridge of ice and overturned, sending her tumbling into the snow with a sharp cry of pain as her ankle twisted beneath her. Lord Blackwell reached her first, his face pale with concern as he helped her sit upright and gently examined her injury, declaring that she must not put weight upon it, and lifting her into his arms to carry her back to the house, despite her protests. And she caught a glimpse of the Duke standing at some distance, motionless among the trees, watching the scene unfold with an expression she could not read across the space that separated them. It was Lord Blackwell who settled her in the drawing-room and called for a maid to bring blankets. But within the hour the estate's physician arrived, sent for, the servant said, by his grace, and it was by the Duke's orders that her ankle was properly bandaged, that a footstool was positioned for her comfort, that hot tea and laudanum were brought for the pain. All of this communicated through intermediaries, as though Sebastian could not bring himself to approach her directly, even in her injury, and Cecilia sat with her throbbing ankle elevated and her heart full of bitter confusion, wondering at a man who would arrange for her every comfort, yet could not speak a single word of concern to her face, who would ensure she received the best possible care, yet would not grant her the basic courtesy of his direct attention, and she found herself both touched by evidence of his concern and furious at his continued refusal to break the silence that stood between them like an impenetrable wall. The physician prescribed 3 days of rest with her ankle elevated, and Cecilia found herself confined to her chambers, with only books and visitors for company, the enforced stillness allowing her thoughts to circle endlessly around the contradictions that seemed to define her situation at Ashford. And on the first morning of her confinement, she woke to find a stack of novels on the table beside her bed, volumes she had mentioned in passing during various conversations, but had not requested, and she assumed Lord Blackwell had remembered her preferences and sent them as a kindness, which indeed seemed consistent with his thoughtful nature. Arabella visited that afternoon with embroidery and gossip, settling herself in the chair beside Cecilia's chaise, with the easy comfort of true friendship, and they spent a pleasant hour discussing the other guests and their various romantic entanglements, until a maid arrived, bearing an armful of hothouse roses, their fragrance filling the room with the scent of summer despite the winter cold beyond the windows. And again, Cecilia felt touched by what she believed to be Lord Blackwell's generosity, though she thought it perhaps excessive, and hoped he would not think her forward for accepting such gifts while they remained merely friends. Or perhaps something slightly more than friends, though nothing had been formally declared. The following day brought a parcel containing the softest cashmere blanket Cecilia had ever touched, dyed a blue that matched her eyes perfectly, and with it came volumes of poetry and a box of crystallized violets, and she was remarking to Arabella during her visit that Lord Blackwell's attentions were becoming quite marked, when her friend looked at her with an expression of confusion and said that Edmund had been riding with several other gentlemen since dawn and had only just returned, which made it impossible for him to have arranged the morning's delivery. And when Cecilia pressed her about who then had sent such gifts, Arabella's expression shifted to something between realization and discomfort, and she admitted quietly that she had seen Sebastian speaking with the housekeeper about procuring specific items, that she had noticed him examining the roses in the conservatory the day before they appeared in Cecilia's room, that she suspected, though she could not be certain, that every anonymous gift that had arrived since the injury had been ordered by her brother. Cecilia sat in stunned silence as this revelation settled over her, her mind struggling to reconcile the Duke, who would not speak a single word to her face, with the man who apparently noticed what books she preferred and what colors she favored, what small luxuries might bring her comfort in her confinement, and she felt her confusion deepen into something almost unbearable. For how could he show such care and such attention to her preferences and needs, yet maintain that cruel prohibition against her speech, that terrible wall of silence that made every kindness feel like a torture because it came without acknowledgement, without the simple human recognition of a direct word or glance? Her heart, which she had been trying so desperately to turn toward Lord Blackwell with his consistent kindness and his straightforward affections, rebelled against her reason and insisted on returning to the Duke, despite all evidence that such feeling was foolish and doomed. And she found herself crying in frustration as Arabella held her hand and said nothing, for what comfort could words provide when the situation itself defied all logic, and left Cecilia suspended between a man who offered everything openly and one who gave everything in shadow, while denying her the one thing she truly wanted, which was simply to be seen and spoken to, as though she mattered, as though she were real and present and worthy of direct regard. By the fourth day, Cecilia's ankle had healed enough for her to venture downstairs again, though she still moved with a slight limp that Lord Blackwell noticed immediately and used as excuse to offer his arm whenever they were in company, and she rejoined the social activities of the house party with a mixture of relief at escaping her confinement and trepidation about facing the Duke again, now that she knew the truth about his secret attentions. And indeed, Sebastian's behavior became even more contradictory in the days that followed, for he would leave a room the moment she entered it, yet she would find her favorite tea waiting at her customary seat in the drawing-room, or he would turn away when their paths crossed in a corridor. Yet the next morning, she would discover that the book she had been searching for in the library had been left outside her chamber door, and the accumulated weight of these anonymous kindnesses, combined with his continued refusal to acknowledge her directly, created a tension that felt unbearable, as though she were living in two different realities simultaneously. It was on a grey afternoon, nearly a week after her recovery, that Lord Blackwell requested a private word with her in the conservatory, and Cecilia's heart sank with the certainty of what was coming, even as she accompanied him among the exotic plants and hothouse flowers. And he spoke with his characteristic directness tempered by genuine feeling, saying that his regard for her had grown beyond simple friendship, that he wished to write to her father to formally request permission to court her with matrimonial intentions. And she found herself unable to immediately refuse, though neither could she bring herself to enthusiastically accept, and so she asked for time to consider, which he granted with the same patience and understanding that marked all his dealings with her, though she saw the flicker of concern in his eyes and knew he sensed her hesitation, stemmed from something more than maidenly uncertainty. That evening a musicale had been arranged in the music room, several of the lady guests performing on pianoforte or harp, while the others listened with varying degrees of genuine appreciation and polite endurance, and Cecilia had not intended to play, for she felt too unsettled by the afternoon's conversation, but Lady Pemberton insisted, and the other guests joined in encouraging her until she could not refuse without seeming churlish, and so she seated herself at the instrument and began to play a piece by Beethoven that she had learned years ago, a melancholic sonata that seemed to capture something of her current emotional state with its minor key and its moments of almost unbearable yearning, alternating with passages of resigned acceptance. She lost herself in the music, as she always did when performing this particular composition, her fingers moving across the keys with the sureness of long practice, while her mind drifted to thoughts of impossible situations and hearts divided against themselves. And she did not notice when the Duke appeared in the doorway at the far end of the room, did not see how he stood utterly still as the music washed over him, and did not observe the way his expression transformed from its usual careful blankness into something raw and exposed. Grief and longing and recognition all visible in the lines of his face for anyone who cared to look. But Arabella saw, seated as she was near the entrance, and she watched her brother's face as Cecilia played, and understood in that moment something she had only suspected before, that whatever complicated feelings Sebastian harbored toward Cecilia ran far deeper than mere resemblance to his late wife or the pain of unwelcome reminders. And when the final notes faded and the guests applauded Cecilia's performance, Arabella glanced toward the doorway again, only to find it empty, her brother having vanished as silently as he had appeared, and she wondered with a mixture of sadness and frustration how long Sebastian intended to maintain this torture of proximity and distance, of caring and silence, before something broke irreparably in the terrible tension he had created. The morning after the musicale, Arabella arrived at Cecilia's chambers earlier than usual, with an expression that suggested she carried something heavy on her mind, and when Cecilia invited her to sit, her friend hesitated before saying that there were things about Sebastian's past that might help Cecilia understand his behavior. Though speaking of them felt like a betrayal of her brother's privacy, yet she could no longer watch two people she cared for suffer in such unnecessary confusion and pain. Arabella settled herself in the chair by the window, where winter sunlight fell pale across her face, and began to speak of Caroline, Sebastian's late wife, describing a woman of remarkable beauty with dark hair and blue eyes, a woman whose portrait still hung in Sebastian's private chambers, though he had removed all other traces of her from the public rooms of the estate. And as Arabella spoke of Caroline's features and coloring, Cecilia felt a cold understanding begin to settle over her, for the description matched her own appearance with an unsettling precision that could not be mere coincidence. The resemblance, Arabella explained with obvious discomfort, was quite striking, not identical certainly, but similar enough that seeing Cecilia had apparently affected Sebastian deeply from the moment she arrived, and Arabella confessed that she had noticed her brother's strange behavior towards Cecilia from the very first dinner, and had suspected the resemblance played some role in his coldness, though she could not fully understand the depth of his reaction or why he would choose cruelty over simple avoidance. Caroline had died 3 years ago, Arabella continued, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, and the circumstances of her death had compounded Sebastian's grief with guilt that he had never been able to resolve, for she had taken ill quite suddenly while he was travelling to London on estate business, and by the time word reached him and he returned to Ashford, she was already gone, buried in the family plot, before he could see her one final time, or speak the words of love and farewell that he would carry unspoken for the rest of his life. Sebastian had blamed himself with an intensity that frightened those who loved him, Arabella said, convinced that if he had been present, he might have somehow prevented her death or at least eased her final hours, and this guilt had transformed him from the warm, engaged man he had been into the cold, withdrawn figure who now presided over Ashford like a ghost haunting his own life, and for 3 years he had lived in a kind of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor entirely claimed by grief, simply existing in the spaces between. Arabella believed that seeing Cecilia had awakened something in Sebastian that he had tried desperately to keep buried, that the resemblance to Caroline served both as a painful reminder of his loss and perhaps as something more complicated that he could not allow himself to acknowledge. For how could he feel anything for someone who looked so much like the wife, whose death he still blamed himself for? And how could he permit himself the possibility of connection when he had not yet forgiven himself for the perceived failures of the past? Cecilia listened to all of this with a mixture of compassion and rising anger, for while she could understand grief and even the paralysis of guilt, she could not accept that these emotions justified, treating her as though she were nothing more than a painful reminder or an unwelcome ghost, for she was her own person, with her own heart and feelings, and she deserved to be seen as Cecilia rather than as some echo of a dead woman, no matter how striking the physical resemblance might be. The knowledge that she looked like Caroline explained Sebastian's initial reaction, but it also made his continued cruelty feel even more unbearable, for he had reduced her to a symbol of his own pain rather than recognizing her as a living woman worthy of basic human respect, and she felt her earlier confusion crystallizing into something sharper and clearer, an understanding that whatever complicated feelings existed between them were poisoned by his refusal to see past his own grief to the reality of who she actually was. February arrived with the announcement that guests would begin departing Ashford in a fortnight's time, the house party having extended far beyond its original duration, but finally reaching its natural conclusion, and the news brought with it a strange mixture of relief and urgency that Cecilia felt like a weight settling over the entire estate. For decisions that had been postponed in the timeless quality of winter isolation could no longer be avoided, and she sensed this shift most acutely in Lord Blackwell's manner, which became more focused and intentional, his attentions moving from the realm of friendship and gentle courtship into something with clearer matrimonial purpose that both honored her and filled her with quiet dread. The Duke, by contrast, seemed to retreat even further into himself, appearing at meals only when absolutely necessary, and vanishing to his private apartments or riding out alone across the frozen grounds for hours at a time, and Cecilia found herself caught between anger at his continued avoidance and a painful understanding of the torment that must drive a man to such extremes of isolation, though understanding did nothing to ease the hurt of being treated as though her very existence caused him suffering. It was on a grey afternoon 5 days after the departure announcement that Cecilia found herself alone in the library, seeking refuge among the books as she had so often during this strange and difficult visit, and she was standing before the shelves near the window when she heard the door open and turned to see the Duke himself entering, clearly not expecting to find anyone in the room, and they stood frozen for a long moment, the length of the library between them, like an unbridgeable chasm. She watched his face, saw the familiar pattern of emotions cross it, the initial recognition followed by something that might have been longing before the walls came up again, and his expression closed, and in that moment something inside Cecilia broke, some final reserve of patience or fear or propriety that had kept her silent in the face of his cruelty, and she found herself walking toward him despite every rule of conduct that said she should remain silent or leave the room. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, and she watched him stiffen at being directly addressed, watched him prepare to leave or perhaps to repeat his original cruel command, but she continued before he could speak, the words spilling out with a force she could not contain. "I understand that you have suffered a terrible loss, and I comprehend now that I bear some unfortunate resemblance to the wife you mourn, but I will not accept being treated as though I am nothing more than a ghost or a painful reminder, for I am my own person, Cecilia Hartwell, and I deserve at minimum the basic respect one human being owes another, regardless of how much looking at me might pain you." The Duke stood absolutely still, his face a mask of anguish, and she saw his hands clench at his sides as though he were physically restraining himself from some action, but he said nothing, maintained the terrible silence he had imposed between them from the very beginning, and Cecilia felt tears begin to burn behind her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I came to this house with admiration for you," she continued, her voice breaking slightly, foolish perhaps, based on a single kindness you showed me years ago when you did not know I was watching, but I believed you to be a man of honor and warmth, and instead I have been met with coldness and cruelty, and while I now understand the source of your pain, understanding does not make the hurt you have caused me any less real, any less devastating, for whatever I look like, I am not her, and I should not be punished for the accident of resemblance or for the timing of my arrival in your life." She waited, hoping desperately that he would speak, that he would offer some explanation or apology or even acknowledgement, but he simply stood there looking at her with an expression of such profound torment that it was almost unbearable to witness, and finally Cecilia turned away, her vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back, and walked from the library with as much dignity as she could muster, leaving the Duke standing alone among the books and the gathering shadows of late afternoon. And it was not until she reached her chambers and closed the door behind her that she allowed herself to weep with the full force of her frustration and heartbreak, and the terrible understanding that some wounds inflict pain on both the one who receives them and the one who delivers them, and that neither party emerges unscathed. Sebastian stood alone in the library long after Cecilia's departure, her words echoing in the silence with a force that made it impossible to retreat into the comfortable numbness he had cultivated for 3 years, and he found himself sinking into the chair by the window where pale winter light fell across his face, revealing the devastation he had hidden so carefully from the world but could no longer hide from himself. She was right, of course, in everything she had said, for he had treated her abominably, had reduced her to nothing more than a symbol of his own torment when she deserved to be seen as her own person, and the shame of this realization burned through him with an intensity that forced him to confront truths he had been fleeing since the moment she arrived at Ashford. The bitter reality was that his cruel command at that first dinner had not been born of contempt but of terror, for when Cecilia had smiled at him across the table with warmth and admiration in her eyes, he had felt something he believed himself no longer capable of feeling, a stirring of connection and possibility that had filled him with such profound guilt that he had lashed out with the only weapon he possessed, the cold dismissal that would ensure she never looked at him that way again. He had recognized her the moment she entered his home, though she clearly did not remember their first meeting 2 years ago in London, a chance encounter in a bookshop where he had helped her reach a volume on a high shelf, and she had thanked him with such genuine warmth that he had carried the memory through the darkness of Caroline's death like a candle flame, cupped against the wind. Even then, newly widowed and drowning in grief, he had noticed Cecilia, had felt an attraction that seemed like a betrayal of everything he owed to Caroline's memory, and so he had fled that bookshop and tried to forget the young woman, with dark hair and kind eyes, who had made him feel momentarily alive again. Her resemblance to Caroline was real, but it was not the resemblance that had struck him most powerfully. For while the physical similarities existed, Cecilia's warmth and liveliness were entirely her own, and it was precisely this vitality that had terrified him, for how could he allow himself to feel drawn to someone who represented not the past, but the possibility of a future, when he had convinced himself that his future had died with his wife, and that any movement beyond grief was a form of abandonment. He had watched her these long months with an obsession he despised in himself, observing her growing friendship with Lord Blackwell with a jealousy that had no right to exist, arranging anonymous comforts for her during her injury, because he could not bear her suffering, but could not allow himself the vulnerability of open, caring, and now he sat in the gathering dusk, understanding with terrible clarity that his silence and cruelty had driven her directly into the arms of a man who was in every way his superior, for Lord Blackwell had shown Cecilia the kindness and respect that Sebastian had deliberately withheld. He attempted several times to write her a letter, to put into words the tangled mass of guilt and longing and self-loathing that had governed his behavior, but each attempt felt inadequate, for how could he explain that his cruelty had been the desperate action of a man trying to protect himself from the terrifying possibility of loving again? And how could he ask for forgiveness when he had spent months systematically destroying any hope she might have harbored for him? And so he sat, surrounded by discarded pages, filled with incomplete confessions, watching through the window as Lord Blackwell walked in the garden below, no doubt planning the proposal that would claim Cecilia forever and relegate Sebastian to exactly the isolated existence he had thought he wanted, but now understood would be a kind of death. Valentine's Day arrived at Ashford with an atmosphere of forced festivity that seemed to highlight, rather than dispel, the underlying tensions that had built throughout the winter, and the servants decorated the great hall with ribbons and hearts cut from crimson paper, while the remaining guests gathered for what would be one of the final celebrations before the house party's conclusion, and Cecilia dressed for the evening with a strange sense of resignation, settling over her like a familiar cloak, for she had made a decision in the days since her confrontation with the Duke, a decision born not of joy but of practicality, and the exhausted understanding that she could not continue to long for a man who had made his rejection of her devastatingly clear. Lord Blackwell had been unfailingly kind, had shown her respect and genuine affection, had proven himself worthy in every measurable way, and while her heart did not race at his approach the way it foolishly continued to race at the mere thought of the Duke, she told herself that steady affection was a more reliable foundation for marriage than the painful intensity of unrequited feeling, and so she prepared herself to embrace whatever future he might offer, to turn her face toward a life that promised kindness if not passion, companionship if not the soul-deep connection she had once dreamed of finding. The Duke was notably absent from the festivities, and Cecilia felt both relief and a piercing disappointment at his absence, for part of her had harbored some desperate hope that seeing her accept another man might finally provoke him to break his silence, though she recognized this hope as the last gasp of foolish romanticism that had caused her nothing but pain. The evening progressed with music and dancing, with games and laughter that felt hollow to Cecilia's ears, though she participated with as much grace as she could summon, and she noticed Lord Blackwell watching her with particular intensity, saw him exchange meaningful glances with several other gentlemen, as though they were privy to some plan, and her stomach tightened with the premonition of what was coming. The proposal she had known was inevitable, but somehow still felt unprepared to receive. As the evening reached its midpoint, Lord Blackwell approached her with unusual formality and asked if she might accompany him to the conservatory, for he had arranged something special for her there, and Cecilia felt her heart begin to pound with dread and duty in equal measure as she placed her hand on his arm and allowed him to lead her away from the crowded hall. The conservatory had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with candles flickering among the potted palms and winter flowers arranged in elaborate displays, and the scent of hothouse blooms hung heavy in the warm air, as Lord Blackwell guided her to the center of the space, where moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling to illuminate a small table set with champagne and a velvet box that could only contain one thing. And Cecilia felt as though she were watching herself from a great distance, observing a scene in which she was actor rather than author, and she tried to summon enthusiasm, or at least warmth, as Lord Blackwell turned to face her with an expression of such hopeful tenderness that she felt guilt join the complicated mixture of emotions already churning within her. Lord Blackwell took both of Cecilia's hands in his own and began to speak with an earnestness that made her chest tighten with guilt and sorrow, for his words were everything a proposal should be, filled with genuine affection and respect, with acknowledgement of her intelligence and grace, with promises of a partnership built on mutual regard and shared values, and she could see in his eyes that he meant every word, that he would be a devoted husband who would honor and cherish her, and part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why accepting him was the rational choice, the safe choice, the choice that would lead to a comfortable life free from the tortured uncertainty that had plagued her these long months at Ashford. He spoke of their compatibility, of the genuine friendship that had developed between them, of his desire to make her happy and to build a life together filled with companionship and shared purpose, and Cecilia felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she could not have said whether they were tears of gratitude or grief, for she recognized the precious gift he was offering her and felt the weight of what she knew she should do, pressing down upon her with inexorable force. And so when he finally asked the question, when he said with trembling hopefulness, "Lady Cecilia Hartwell, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" She drew a breath that felt like surrender and opened her mouth to speak the words that would seal her fate and allow her to finally escape the impossible longing that had brought her nothing but pain. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word emerging with less conviction than she had hoped, but with finality nonetheless, and she continued, "I will," but the second word caught in her throat as movement in the doorway drew her eye, and she turned her head to see the Duke of Ashford standing there, as though conjured by her subconscious desperation, his face illuminated by candlelight in a way that revealed every line of anguish carved there. And their eyes met across the conservatory with an impact that felt physical, and she saw in his expression such naked devastation that her breath stopped entirely. For this was not the cold, controlled man who had commanded her silence months ago, but rather someone stripped of all defenses, someone whose careful walls had crumbled to reveal the raw suffering beneath. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one moved or spoke, and Cecilia felt suspended between two futures, between the words she had almost completed and the unspoken plea she could read in the Duke's eyes. And she understood with sudden clarity that this was the crisis point upon which everything would turn, that the next moments would determine the shape of her entire life. And then Sebastian's voice cut through the silence, addressing her directly for the first time since that terrible first evening, his tone rough with emotion, as he said the words that shattered the careful resignation she had built around her heart. "Cecilia, please," he said, and the use of her Christian name felt like an intimacy after months of formal distance. "Please, don't," and the desperation in those simple words carried all the confession he had been unable to speak before. And Cecilia stood frozen with Lord Blackwell's hand still holding hers, her incomplete acceptance hanging in the air between them, like something that might still be retracted or might solidify into unchangeable reality, while the Duke remained in the doorway, looking as though his presence there required every ounce of courage he possessed. And she realized that after months of silence and cruelty and inexplicable behavior, Sebastian had finally found his voice precisely at the moment when she had been about to close the door on any possibility between them forever. The silence that followed Sebastian's desperate plea stretched taut as a wire about to break, and Lord Blackwell's hands released Cecilia's, as though he suddenly understood that he had never truly held them at all, for whatever existed between her and the Duke had claimed her long before he had entered the story, and he stepped back with the careful dignity of a man determined to preserve his honor, even in the moment of its unraveling, and he said with admirable composure, though pain flickered across his features, "I believe there is something that needs to be said between you, something that perhaps should have been said long ago, and I am gentleman enough to recognize when I have been playing a part in someone else's tragedy rather than authoring my own happiness." And he looked at Cecilia with understanding that made her eyes sting with tears of gratitude and guilt. And then he turned to Sebastian with an expression that held warning alongside resignation, as he added, "I trust you understand what you are asking for, Ashford, what you are interrupting, and I hope you prove yourself worthy of such an extraordinary woman, for she deserves far better than silence and cruelty dressed as protection." And with that he withdrew from the conservatory, with his head held high though his shoulders carried the weight of disappointment, leaving Cecilia and Sebastian alone among the flowers and candlelight that had been meant to witness a different ending entirely. For several heartbeats neither of them moved, and Cecilia felt the full force of months of suppressed emotion rising within her, like a tide that had been held back too long, and she did not know whether she wanted to weep or rage or simply collapse under the exhaustion of feeling so much for so long with nowhere to direct it. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged sharp with pain as she said, "How dare you? How dare you wait until this moment to break your silence? How dare you let me suffer months of your coldness and contempt, only to interrupt when I finally find the courage to move forward?" But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were defensive armor against the dangerous hope, beginning to unfurl in her chest. For his presence here, his desperate plea, meant something she hardly dared to acknowledge. Sebastian moved toward her with hesitant steps, as though approaching something precious and breakable, and his face in the candlelight showed such naked vulnerability that it transformed him entirely from the cold Duke who had commanded her silence into someone achingly human and afraid, and he began to speak with words that tumbled out as though a dam had broken. "Forgive me, Cecilia. Forgive me for my cruelty and my cowardice, for choosing silence when I should have chosen courage, for treating you with coldness when every fiber of my being longed to speak to you, to know you, to tell you that from the moment I saw you 2 years ago at the Pemberton ball, when you smiled at me with such genuine kindness after I had withdrawn from society into my grief, I have been unable to think of anyone else, unable to imagine wanting anyone else, and when you appeared at Ashford this winter, it felt like both a gift and a curse. For seeing you again broke open everything I had tried to seal away, all the guilt over Caroline's death, all the fear that loving again meant betraying her memory, and all the terror that if I allowed myself to care, I would somehow lose again, and the pain would destroy what little remained of me." He ran his hand through his hair with agitation born of months of internal torment, and continued with increasing urgency. "I told myself I was protecting you from my broken state, that you deserved someone whole and uncomplicated like Blackwell, someone who could offer you joy untainted by grief and regret. But the truth is, I was protecting myself, hiding behind my loss, rather than facing the terrifying possibility that life might offer second chances to those who fear they do not deserve them. And I watched you with him, watched you smile and laugh, and slowly prepare to build a future that did not include me. And I told myself it was right, that I should be content to have preserved you from the darkness I carry. But tonight, when I heard you begin to accept his proposal, I understood with devastating clarity that I had made a terrible mistake, that my silence had not protected either of us but had instead caused the very loss I feared, and I cannot let you bind yourself to another without telling you the truth I should have spoken months ago." Cecilia stood trembling with the force of emotions she could not name, feeling anger and relief and confusion, and a dangerous resurrection of hope warring within her, and she heard herself ask, though her voice shook, "And what truth is that, Sebastian? What truth justifies months of deliberate cruelty? What truth makes it acceptable to humiliate me before your guests, and then show concern through servants while refusing to speak a single word directly to me?" And she saw him flinch at her words, but pressed on because she needed to hear him say it. He needed him to speak with complete honesty the feelings he had hidden for so long. He met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch, and said with quiet devastation, "The truth is that I love you, that I have loved you since that moment 2 years ago when you looked at me with compassion rather than pity, that seeing you again this winter felt like being offered salvation I did not deserve, and my fear of that feeling, my guilt over moving beyond Caroline, my terror of vulnerability after loss made me cruel when I should have been honest, made me silent when I should have spoken, and I do not ask you to choose me. Cecilia, I do not ask you to forgive what I have done, or to believe that I deserve any consideration after how I have treated you. I ask only that you understand and that you know the truth before you make your decision, that you do not accept Blackwell believing that I felt nothing when in truth I felt everything and simply lacked the courage to say so." Cecilia felt the confession wash over her like a wave that simultaneously validated everything she had felt and ignited a fury at the months of unnecessary suffering, and the conflicting emotions rose within her with such force that she had to press her hand against her chest as though to contain them, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with barely controlled anger as she said, "You loved me, you have loved me all this time, and yet you chose to make me feel worthless, to humiliate me before your guests, to watch me struggle through months of confusion and pain when a single honest word could have changed everything." And she saw him flinch as though her words were physical blows, but she could not stop because the rage felt cleansing after so long spent swallowing hurt, and she continued with increasing passion, "Do you understand what you did to me, Sebastian? Do you comprehend the cruelty of your silence? I came to Ashford carrying a fragile hope born of one kind moment you showed me 2 years ago, a foolish romantic notion that perhaps the man who had looked at me with such warmth might remember me with favor, and you crushed that hope immediately and thoroughly. You made me question my worth and my judgment. You made me feel invisible and unwanted, and all the while you claim you were feeling everything I longed for you to feel, but simply lacked the courage to say so." And tears were streaming down her face now, though her voice remained steady with righteous anger. But even as she spoke, she felt something else beneath the fury, a desperate relief that she had not been imagining the moments of connection, that the longing had not been entirely one-sided, that perhaps she was not the fool she had believed herself to be for caring about someone who seemed to hold her in contempt. Sebastian stood before her, accepting her anger without defense, his own face wet with tears that shocked her, for she had never imagined the controlled Duke of Ashford capable of such visible emotion, and he said with broken humility, "You are right, you are absolutely right. There is no justification for what I did, no excuse that makes it acceptable. I was cruel when I should have been honest. I was a coward when I should have been brave, and I have spent every day since that first terrible evening regretting my words but lacking the strength to take them back, watching you from a distance and dying by degrees as I saw you slowly, giving your heart to a man who deserved it far more than I." And he moved closer, though he did not presume to touch her, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he added, "I do not ask you to forgive me, Cecilia. I do not expect you to overlook months of pain simply because I have finally found my voice. I know that Lord Blackwell is the better choice, the safer choice, the man who has shown you consistent kindness while I have shown you only contradiction and hurt, and if you choose him, I will understand. I will accept it as the just consequence of my cowardice. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to understand that every cold word concealed feelings I was too afraid to acknowledge, that my cruelty was never about you, but about my own inability to move beyond grief and guilt." Cecilia felt her anger, warring with the treacherous hope that his words ignited, and she found herself saying with a complexity of emotion that surprised her, "For months I told myself that what I felt for you was foolish, that I was clinging to a fantasy built on one moment of kindness from 2 years ago, that I needed to accept reality and appreciate the genuine affection that Lord Blackwell offered me, and I nearly succeeded, Sebastian. I nearly convinced myself that safety and certainty were worth more than the dangerous possibility that you might feel something for me. After all, I was seconds away from accepting a proposal that would have closed the door on any future between us, and you stopped me at the very last moment, and I do not know whether to be grateful or furious, whether to see your timing as fate or cruelty." And she looked at him with eyes that held both longing and uncertainty, and asked the question that lay at the heart of her turmoil. "How can I trust that this is real, that you will not retreat back into silence the moment I allow myself to believe in what you are telling me? How can I risk my heart on someone who has already shown himself capable of such deliberate coldness?" He met her gaze with devastating honesty and said, You cannot know with certainty, and I cannot offer you guarantees because I am still learning how to live beyond the paralysis that grief created. But I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to prove myself worthy of a second chance, that I will fight my instinct to hide behind walls, that I will choose courage over self-protection, even when it terrifies me. And I can tell you that losing you to my own cowardice has taught me that the pain of vulnerability is nothing compared to the agony of watching you walk away. And Cecilia stood trembling in the candlelight of the conservatory, where she had nearly promised herself to another man, suspended between the rational choice that would lead to contentment and the dangerous choice that might lead to extraordinary happiness or devastating heartbreak. And she understood that this moment would define the rest of her life, that whatever she decided now would echo through all her years to come, and the weight of that knowledge was almost more than she could bear. Cecilia stood in the conservatory long after Sebastian had left her, with a final look of desperate hope, surrounded by the flowers and candles that Lord Blackwell had arranged with such care, and she felt the weight of the decision before her pressing down upon her like a physical force, for she understood that what she chose in the coming hours would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her life, and the knowledge that two good men waited for her answer, one who had shown her consistent kindness and deserved better than to be second choice, another who had caused her months of pain but offered the dangerous possibility of extraordinary love, made her feel as though she were being torn in two directions by equal and opposite forces. She knew she needed to speak with Lord Blackwell, that he deserved honesty and clarity rather than being left in suspended uncertainty while she wrestled with her heart, and so she sought him out in the drawing-room, where he stood by the window looking out at the winter night, with the posture of a man steeling himself for disappointment. And when she entered, he turned to her with such gentle understanding in his eyes that she felt her throat constrict with guilt and gratitude in equal measure. And before she could speak, he said with quiet dignity, "You do not need to explain, Cecilia. I saw your face when Ashford interrupted us. I saw the way you looked at him, and I understand now what perhaps I should have recognized earlier, that your heart has always belonged elsewhere, even as you tried to convince yourself otherwise. And while I had hoped that consistency and genuine affection might win where passion once claimed you, I am not so foolish as to believe that safety alone can compete with love." She felt tears streaming down her face as she took his hands and said with trembling sincerity, "You have been everything kind and good. Edmund, you have shown me respect and consideration when I desperately needed both, and you deserve someone whose heart is entirely free to love you without reservation or conflicted feeling. Someone who does not carry the complicated history and painful longing that I bring to every interaction, and I am so deeply sorry that I allowed our friendship to develop into courtship when some part of me must have known that my heart was not fully my own to give." And she saw the flash of pain cross his features, though he maintained his composure with admirable grace, and he squeezed her hands gently before releasing them, as he replied, "Do not apologize for being honest, for that is a greater kindness than false promises would have been, and I release you from any obligation you might feel toward me, though I hope you will choose carefully what you do next. And for Ashford has caused you considerable pain, and while I understand that love is rarely simple or convenient, you deserve someone who will choose courage over cowardice and who will speak truth rather than hide behind silence and grief." She nodded through her tears and thanked him with genuine warmth for his understanding, and he left her with a final gentle smile that held both disappointment and sincere wishes for her happiness, proving himself noble even in the moment of losing what he had hoped to gain. And after he departed, Cecilia found herself alone with the enormity of what she had just done, for she had released herself from the safe and certain path, but had not yet committed to the dangerous and complicated alternative, and she spent the following days walking the winter grounds of Ashford in solitary contemplation, bundled against the cold, while her thoughts chased themselves in circles of fear and hope and uncertainty. Arabella found her during one of these walks and fell into step beside her with the comfortable ease of true friendship. And after they had walked in silence for some minutes, she said gently, "I know you are wrestling with an impossible decision, trying to weigh safety against passion, certainty against risk, but I wonder if you are asking yourself the right questions, for perhaps the choice is not between two men, but between two versions of yourself, the careful woman who protects her heart from further pain, and the brave woman who risks everything for the possibility of profound love." And Cecilia looked at her friend with eyes that held exhaustion and confusion, as she replied, "But how can I trust that Sebastian will not retreat back into silence the moment I allow myself to believe in his feelings? How can I risk my heart on someone who has already demonstrated such capacity for cruelty, even if that cruelty was rooted in his own pain and fear?" Arabella was quiet for a moment before answering with thoughtful wisdom, "You cannot know with certainty. None of us can predict the future or guarantee that those we love will never hurt us again, but I have watched my brother these past months, and I have seen him transform from the frozen, grief-stricken man he became after Caroline's death into someone desperate and alive with feeling, and I believe that losing you has taught him what his years of mourning could not, that life offers second chances only to those brave enough to reach for them, and I think the real question you must answer is not whether he deserves another chance, but whether you can live with yourself if you choose safety over the truth of your own heart." The words settled into Cecilia like seeds, finding fertile ground, and she walked on through the winter landscape as the truth became increasingly clear. For she understood that denying what she felt for Sebastian in favor of protecting herself from potential pain was itself a kind of death, a slow suffocation of the most vital part of herself, and while she could not know whether choosing him would lead to happiness or heartbreak, she knew with sudden certainty that choosing otherwise would lead to a lifetime of wondering what might have been and of looking back with regret at the moment when fear triumphed over courage. And as the pale winter sun broke through the clouds, she felt her decision crystallize with the clarity of ice forming on still water. Understanding that love was never truly safe or simple, but that the alternative to risk was not protection, but merely the illusion of it, purchased at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Cecilia found Sebastian in his study the following afternoon, standing by the window where pale winter light filtered through the frost-patterned glass, and when he turned at the sound of the door opening, she saw in his face such careful hope, tempered by fear of disappointment, that her heart clenched with the knowledge of how much power she held in this moment to either heal or devastate, and she crossed the room slowly while gathering her courage, and when she stood before him, she said with a steadiness that belied the trembling in her hands, "I have made my decision, Sebastian, and I choose you, but I choose you with conditions that are not negotiable, for I will not enter into something that requires me to accept silence or walls, or the perpetual fear that you will retreat back into grief whenever vulnerability becomes difficult." And she saw him draw in a sharp breath, as though her words were both gift and blow, and she continued with increasing firmness, "If we are to have any future together, you must promise me honesty even when truth is uncomfortable. You must promise me presence even when emotion feels overwhelming. You must promise me partnership rather than the kind of distant protection that masquerades as care, but is truly just another form of abandonment. And I need to know that you understand what I am asking, that you are capable of meeting me in the open rather than hiding behind the safety of solitude and self-protection." Sebastian moved toward her with such intensity of feeling in his eyes that she felt her breath catch, and he took her hands in his with a gentleness that contradicted the strength of his grip, and he said, with voice thick with emotion, "I understand what you are asking, Cecilia, and I accept your conditions not as burdens, but as guides toward becoming the man I should have been all along. The man I was before grief taught me that loving meant inevitable loss, and that protection meant building walls so high that nothing could touch me. And I promise you that I will fight every instinct towards silence, that I will choose courage over comfort, that I will meet you in honesty, even when every part of me wants to retreat into the familiar darkness that has been my companion these 3 years." And he released one of her hands to touch her face with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. and he added with devastating sincerity, "I cannot promise that I will always succeed, that I will never stumble or momentarily fall back into old patterns, but I can promise that I will always return, that I will always choose you over my fear, and that I will spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me was not misplaced." They stood together in the study, while afternoon faded toward evening, and their first real conversation unfolded with the tentative honesty of two people learning to trust after months of misunderstanding and pain. And Sebastian led her to the portrait gallery, where Caroline's likeness hung among generations of Ashford ancestors, and Cecilia looked upon the face of the woman who had held his heart, and saw indeed a resemblance in colouring and features, though the expression was entirely different. And Sebastian spoke of his late wife with genuine love, but also with a sense of release, acknowledging the grief that had defined him, while also recognizing that honoring Caroline's memory did not require him to remain forever frozen in the moment of her death. And he said quietly as they stood before the portrait, "She would not have wanted this for me, this half-life I have been living. She was generous and warm, and would have told me that love is not a finite resource that must be hoarded, but rather something that expands to hold new feeling alongside treasured memory." And Cecilia felt in that moment the last of her uncertainty dissolve, for she understood that she was not replacing anyone, but rather writing a new chapter in a story that had known both tragedy and the possibility of redemption. Sebastian asked with humility that touched her deeply if she would allow him to court her properly, to earn through consistent action and genuine presence what he had nearly lost through cowardice and silence. And Cecilia agreed with the understanding that they would build their relationship on the foundation of truth they had finally established. And as they left the portrait gallery together, she felt the weight of the past months begin to lift, replaced by something fragile but genuine, the beginning of trust that would need time and patience to grow into the kind of love that could sustain a lifetime. Spring arrived at Ashford with the gentle insistence of renewal, as though nature itself conspired to mirror the transformation unfolding between Cecilia and Sebastian. And the months that followed, their decision to build something true together, were marked by the kind of deliberate courtship that neither had experienced before, for this was not the superficial dance of London ballrooms, but rather the deep excavation of two souls, learning to trust after understanding how fragile and precious such trust truly was. And Sebastian proved himself faithful to every promise he had made in that study, where winter light had witnessed their new beginning. They walked together through grounds that shifted from snow-covered stillness to the first brave crocuses pushing through thawing earth, and then to daffodils nodding in spring breezes, and during these walks they spoke of everything and nothing, building the foundation of genuine knowledge that only comes from accumulated hours of honest conversation. And Cecilia watched as the frozen duke she had first encountered melted away to reveal the man he had been before grief claimed him. Though this version was deeper and more appreciative, someone who understood the value of what he had nearly lost through his own cowardice, and would not take for granted the gift of being seen and chosen despite his failures. Sebastian courted her with the kind of attention that showed he had listened to every word she had ever spoken, remembering her casual mention of preferring wildflowers to hothouse roses, and appearing one morning with arms full of primroses picked from the estate's meadows, recalling her love of poetry and spending an evening reading Wordsworth aloud, while she sat curled in the chair opposite his in the library that had once been the site of such painful silence, demonstrating through 100 small gestures that he was present and attentive in ways that his earlier behavior had denied. And Cecilia felt herself opening like the spring flowers, allowing hope and joy to take root where pain and confusion had lived for so long. As April gave way to May, Sebastian asked her father's permission for her hand with all the formal correctness that society demanded, and when the blessing was granted, he planned a proposal that honored both the poetry of new love and the hard-won honesty of their particular journey. And he brought her to the rose garden just as evening descended, and the first stars appeared in the violet sky. And there, among flowers not yet blooming but heavy with the promise of summer beauty, he knelt before her with hands that trembled slightly, and eyes that held such open vulnerability that she felt her heart might burst from the enormity of in the moment. And he spoke words he had written and memorized, comparing her to light after long darkness, to courage in the face of fear, to every good thing he had thought himself unworthy of receiving, and he asked her to be his wife, not because he deserved her, but because he would spend every remaining day of his life becoming someone who might, and she said yes, with tears streaming down her face and joy singing through every part of her being. And when he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, she felt the click of something settling into rightness, as though all the pain of the preceding months had been necessary preparation for this moment of perfect clarity. Their engagement was celebrated with the kind of genuine happiness that only comes when those gathered understand the unlikely path the couple had traveled to reach this point, and Arabella embraced Cecilia with tears of joy and whispered that she had never seen her brother so alive, so present, so wholly himself, as he had become, through loving and being loved by someone who demanded his full participation in life. And the wedding was planned for late June, when summer would be in full bloom and the estate gardens at their most glorious. And as the day approached, Cecilia felt none of the nervousness that brides were supposed to experience, but rather a deep, settling certainty that she was choosing exactly as she should, that the man waiting for her at the altar would meet her with the honesty and courage he had promised. And when the day arrived with perfect June sunshine and roses climbing the chapel walls in cascading abundance, she walked down the aisle toward Sebastian and saw in his face such gratitude and love and determined commitment that she knew every moment of pain had been worth enduring for the gift of this hard-won, honestly built love. They exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promising not the conventional obedience and provision, but rather honesty even in difficulty, presence even in pain, courage even in fear, and partnership, built on the understanding that love required active choice rather than passive acceptance. And when the vicar pronounced them married, and Sebastian kissed her with tender reverence before all their gathered loved ones, Cecilia felt the story that had begun with such cruelty and confusion transform into something entirely new, a narrative of redemption and second chances, and the extraordinary things that become possible when people choose vulnerability over protection, truth over comfortable silence, and the uncertain beauty of genuine connection over the hollow safety of isolation. 3 years had passed since that June wedding when roses climbed the chapel walls, and two people who had nearly lost each other to silence and fear exchanged vows of courage and honesty. And now, in the golden afternoon of an early autumn day, Cecilia stood at the window of the drawing room, watching her children play in the gardens of Ashford, their laughter carrying on the breeze like music that had once seemed impossible in these halls that grief had rendered silent. And she felt Sebastian's arms encircle her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder and murmured with contentment that never failed to move her, "I still cannot believe this is real, that I am permitted such happiness after coming so close to destroying it through my own cowardice." And she leaned back against him with the comfortable certainty of a love that had been tested and proven strong, watching as their daughter Eleanor chased butterflies while their son Thomas tottered after her on legs still unsteady with the newness of walking. And everywhere she looked were signs of the transformation that love and courage had wrought. The halls now filled with fresh flowers and open windows, the rooms once shrouded in mourning now bright with life and the constant presence of family and friends, the very air different, as though the house itself had learned to breathe again after years of holding its breath in sympathetic grief. Dear listener, I share this story with you not merely as a tale of romance overcome obstacles, but as a meditation on the courage required to speak truth before silence becomes permanent, to choose vulnerability over the false safety of emotional protection, to understand that timing matters less than honesty and that second chances are precious gifts. We must have the bravery to accept when they are offered, for Cecilia and Sebastian's journey teaches us that the words we leave unspoken can cause as much harm as cruel ones uttered in haste, that walls built to protect our hearts often become prisons that prevent us from receiving the very love we most desire, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not grand gesture, but simple honesty. The willingness to say what we feel before fear convinces us that silence is safer than risk. Perhaps you too have stood at the crossroads where Sebastian stood, paralyzed by past pain and unable to move toward future possibility. Or perhaps you have been where Cecilia was, loving someone who cannot or will not meet you in honesty. And if so, I hope this story reminds you that it is never too late to speak truth, never too late to tear down walls, never too late to choose courage over comfortable isolation, for the human heart is more resilient than we imagine, and love more powerful than the fear that seeks to contain it. May you find the strength to speak before silence becomes permanent. May you choose vulnerability even when protection seems safer. May you understand that authentic connection requires the risk of being truly seen, and may you know that the love worth having is the love that demands your full presence and honest participation, rather than the pale shadow that asks nothing and gives nothing in return. May your nights be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may you wake to mornings filled with the kind of joy that comes from living authentically and loving courageously. And if this story has touched your heart, please share it with others who might need to hear that second chances are possible, that silence can be broken, and that the courage to be vulnerable is the very foundation upon which lasting love is built.